Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Kara Marsh Prophet. I serve the University of San Diego as Director of Alumni Operations and Engagement. I'm thrilled to offer you to today's session, Power Without Conscience, Understanding Toxic Leadership. Today's session is co-hosted by the USD Alumni Association and the Knauss School of Business, and will feature one of USD's favorite professors, who also happens to be one of my favorite colleagues, Simon Croom. The mission of the Alumni Association is to engage and enrich the Torero community for life. Today's session certainly aims to do just that. A few housekeeping items before we get started. You may have noticed we are using Zoom webinar today, not Zoom meeting. This means that you get to sit back, relax, and enjoy the broadcast. Please use the Q&A feature to post questions for Simon. You may upvote questions as well. Today's session is being recorded and will be posted to the Alumni Association's YouTube channel next week. A special hello to anyone who is watching this recording. I'd now like to introduce one of my colleagues, Bridget Breitenberg, Assistant Director for Alumni Relations for the Knauss School of Business. Welcome to the screen, Bridget, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Kara, and welcome to all the lifelong learners out there. It's such a joy to have you on, and this is obviously a fascinating topic. We have so many of you registered, which is exciting. And it's my pleasure now to introduce you to our guest speaker today, Dr. Simon Croom, Professor of Supply Chain Management. Dr. Croom is one of the most cited academic authors in the field. He joined the University of San Diego's Knauss School of Business in 2005 as the executive director of the Supply Chain Management Institute and academic director for the Master in Supply Chain Management program. Simon has also served as an advisor on e-procurement to the UK government and has delivered keynote talks around the world on supply chain management, strategic improvement, and more recently on disordered personality in executives, which is what we're going to be hearing about today. And so it is my pleasure to introduce and welcome you, Simon.
Thank you. Thank you, Bridget, and thank you to Cara. And welcome. And it's a joy to see some new names and some familiar names in the attendance list. By all means, pose questions through the Q&A, and I'll try and answer those either as we go along or at the very end. I'm also going to take the pulse of the audience at 3 different points with some polls. So I'm interested to learn from you. Why are you interested in learning from me about this topic? But I'm sure together we'll go on an interesting journey today. Okay, so let me share my screen. Hopefully that's all working fine. So just a little bit of background about myself and why this topic. So I'm a procurement guy, a supply chain professor, been an academic for 35 years, but before that worked in business. I've done a lot of consulting, worked with government, worked with non-profits, worked with many for-profit organizations. And a question kept bugging me probably 15 years ago, talking to students who were sharing some challenges, let's put it politely, with operations improvement initiatives. And one of my dear colleagues, a very famous consultant called Robert Porter Lynch, said to me, you need to look into the Dark Triad. And that was that. So that's what we're looking at today. We're going to think about the Dark Triad. So let me just share the agenda with you. I want to be very clear, this is not about diagnosis of any individual. That's not my role. It's really about sharing an understanding on the personality construct of the Dark Triad. The Dark Triad basically refers to psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, 3 elements of disordered personality in some ways. I want to talk about the characteristics and traits that accompany the Dark Triad as well. So we've got some understanding of that. Looking at observable rhetoric, what do people say? How do they behave? And then share empirical evidence with you of not just my research, but other research in this area. And then finally, to share strategies related to how can we address toxic leadership or difficult leadership, shall we say, but it's usually toxic. So why do I have the audacity to talk about this? I have a graduate degree in psychology from the University of Liverpool. Actually, as a lifelong learner, I graduated when I was 61 with that. I've published a number of articles and been very fortunate to work with Katrina or Kate Fritzen and Nathan Brooks, both what I would call real psychologists because that's their career path all the way through. Kate in particular, I'll talk about again shortly, but fundamentally I reached out to Kate because she was one of the first people to explore dark triad toxic personality in business executives. Another guy who's very influential is Professor Robert Hare, a Canadian. This is me at the Symposium for the Scientific Study of Psychopathy, which sounds like all S's, but obviously psychopathy has a P, and had the joy of having a conversation with him. I would point out that he's 25 years older than me in this photograph, and he looks about 5 years older than me, but fascinating guy. And what he said was this, that psychopaths are predators. So there is an evolutionary element to why psychopaths exist in humans. But these are important things to think about, that they use charm, manipulation, intimidation, sometimes violence to control others. And I've highlighted two things here. One is the predatory nature. The other is lacking in conscience and in feelings for others. He said that they cold-bloodedly take what they want and do as they please, and are responsible for a markedly disproportionate amount of serious crime, violence, and social distress in society. The reason I mentioned Robert Hare, apart from him being an amazing guy and an amazing author, was that he was asked at a conference of police commissioners, are all psychopaths in prison? And he said, yeah, no. Some of them are in boardrooms. And that was in the late 1990s. And that was the catalyst for a slow but increasing element of attention to the issue of psychopaths. He wrote a book, co-authored a book called Snakes in Suits, and I highly recommend that to you. It's 20 years old, but I highly recommend it to you. But the guy who was first associated with identification of psychopathy is a guy called Hervey Cleckley, which is the dream name for a psychologist. And he said that more often than not, the typical psychopath will seem particularly agreeable and make a distinctly positive impression when he is first encountered. And I'll stress the he, and we'll come back to that. Very often indications of good sense and sound reasoning will emerge, and one is likely to feel soon after meeting him that this normal and pleasant person is also one with high abilities. So I talked about psychopaths being predators. We also have to think about chameleons who can adapt to their environment. Why I was interested in this is for a number of reasons. One, there's a lot of evidence in the literature that on average, we are going to encounter 3 toxic leaders in an 18-year period. This is a study by Ken Williams, and I can share that with you later. Strange numbers. It means on average, once every 6 years, you'll meet a toxic leader. But the significance of this study was that he found that over half, 58% of workers avoid a toxic leader. So one strategy that seems to be innate in us is to avoid people who we consider to be toxic, or we recognize as toxic, or we think are toxic. 52% of workers worry about that. So workplace stress. 26% of workers encounter aggressive workplace behavior. All of these things lead to emotional exhaustion. And I'll pose this rhetorical question, which is, how often do we feel at the end of a year or the end of a quarter completely exhausted? And to what extent is that emotional as opposed to we've just had to get the accounts finished or whatever? He also found something interesting. And as a procurement guy, I'm very interested in the incidence of fraud and misuse of procurement processes. And it said, and his study highlighted that toxic or dark triad leaders more likely to use abnormal accruals. In other words, crooked accounting, and a lot more unethical decisions. So let's dig in to the dark triad, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. I'm going to ask you one question in a minute. So the dark triad consists of narcissism. Most of us understand what that means, but it manifests itself as this sort of grandiose self-image, entitlement, which is a word we hear bandied around, probably inappropriately, a lot, but it is an innate, deep belief that somebody is entitled to things that others aren't because of just who they are. Admiration seeking, constantly need attention, affirmation, their name all over the place. Machiavellianism, obviously from Machiavelli and his writings on the prince, but really it's about manipulative deception. Very strategic, thinking about the long term. And we'll dig into that. And then psychopathy, which is really about callous, impulsive, low remorse. We often think of psychopaths as, the classic serial killer. But the reality is that a lot of people, a lot of individuals who are on the psychopathy scale are not necessarily going to be violent individuals. There's type 1 and type 2 psychopathy, but we'll address that a little bit. But what I want to do now, Kira, if you can open the first poll, and I'll ask you to address that. So hopefully you can all see this. The question is, where have you most observed toxic leadership behaviors? In a corporate, political, community or nonprofit, academic, or have not observed this directly? And whilst you're doing that, there have been 3 questions. Do leaders refer to any level of leader or even middle management? It's anybody who has responsibility for directing others. So it could be a supervisor, it could be a shop floor foreman, it could be a retail store manager, it could be the CEO. So Jessica, it essentially refers to anybody with responsibility for others, because that's one of the important factors. And that responsibility for others can include customers. So if you've got a lot of clients, but you don't employ anybody. Are the ratios, good question, Anastasia, Tasha, are the ratio of toxic leaders different at different levels? The answer is yes. I won't have a chance to share that, but we talk about that in the book. But if you're interested, I can share information after. Oh, Jamie, does dark triad evolve over time? There's definitely some adaptation. We know that personality traits change over time. Conscientiousness, for example, can increase over time. Neuroticism can decrease over time. So we're early stages in understanding that. I've got a study that we're analyzing at the moment with about 1,500 respondents. And one of those things is to look at age relationship. And we certainly did in one of our studies find that certain elements of behaviors do change over time. Okay, so hopefully we've had a chance to answer that poll. Cara, if you want to close that and then just out of interest, pop up the findings, that would be great. Yeah, here we go. Sort of, we've seen it in our organization. We see it in public leadership. Certainly, I'm not going to get into that, but certainly it's one of the challenges that has been written about a lot in the last 15, 20 years. Academic institutions, well, we work at a university, community or non-profit. Yeah, it's interesting, only 3% of you have not experienced this directly. Yeah. So let's think about the relationship of psychopathy to performance. In other words, why should we care? But there is some interesting work on successful psychopaths. Kevin Dutton from Oxford in particular has written about this. And there have been a number of other studies that I talk about in my undergraduate and graduate courses that have shown that in some ways psychopathic traits are necessary. They exist for a reason. It's not just about being predatory, it's about being able to control emotions. For example, if you're a first responder, a brain surgeon, a special forces operative, if you get really anxious and you're nervous about upsetting other people, it makes it a little bit more difficult. Whereas if you can detach yourself, maybe not get emotionally involved, it's called social affect. If you have a lack of affect, that can help you. They talk about the God complex that surgeons and consultants have in some of the healthcare literature. And Henry Moore, who's a British brain surgeon, writes about this, that at certain stages in his career, he felt like he had godlike powers. These were his words, not mine. But he realized that it was because of how he became detached from the emotion of operating on an individual and became focused on the mechanics. So what we've seen in the research, and Babiak and Robert Hare published some research in 2002, I believe it was, and what they found is that the higher individual score on psychopathy, on the psychopathic checklist in particular, slightly higher relationship to communication, creativity, strategic thinking, innovation. One example that is often cited is that of Steve Jobs, that he was a great visionary, a great communicator, great strategic vision. But what they also found, which was more statistically significant, is that there is a negative relationship between scoring high on psychopathy, shall we say, and your management ability, your ability to be a team player, your leadership capability, and overall performance, financial performance, and so forth. And that's an important reason for why we try to study psychopathy. So one of the questions is, why does psychopathy or toxicity arise? And that was one of the questions here. There's a charisma trap side of it, that dark traits are directly correlated with rapid promotion and leadership emergence, and extroversion and high impression management allow individuals to thrive. So Clive Boddy has written numerous articles and books on corporate psychopathy and pointed out that individuals who are charismatic, strong ego, good at impression management, may also carry with them elements of psychopathy, which drive them to be successful. In other words, they navigate organizations very well. And we will talk about how they do that. Second side of it, of course, is the dark reality that, as we've just seen, meta-analysis, not just the Babiak and Hare study, shows that there's almost no correlation between dark triad traits and effective leadership. And narcissistic leaders drastically inflate reports of effectiveness. So that's reflecting what I've just shown you in the data. And this little polar diagram I really like, because it shows that one of the questions was, does toxicity evolve over time? A sort of other relationship is, well, is narcissism good, bad, or negative? And it depends. You need to recognize that extreme degrees of narcissism really has a massive impact on team leadership. moderate amounts of narcissism. So I should say that we measure narcissism, psychopathy on a scale, and I'm a believer that it is scalar. It's not binary. You're not either a narcissist or not. There are degrees of narcissistic personality traits. And so some degree of narcissism, self-confidence, may be helpful, but extreme narcissism is very destructive in organizations. There have been a number of studies that have looked at, for example, CEO communications and corporate communications. And if an individual, the CEO, is front and center in most communications, whether it seems completely relevant or not, that's a sign of high narcissism. You tend to find lower levels of performance. So what is psychopathic personality disorder? So let's take the psychopathy dimension first and foremost. As I mentioned, The Mask of Insanity by Hervey Cleckley. He said that in his work, he noticed 4 dimensions: how people deal with others, interpersonal; how people react and care about others, that's called affective; how they live their life; and the extent to which they operate within the confines of norms. And typically, when we talk about psychopathy, we talk about extreme levels of all 4 of those. So again, I'm not going to read all of this to you. I'll leave it there for you to have a quick glance over. We will be sharing, obviously, the recording. I'm happy to share the slides. But you've got 4 facets: this interpersonal, grandiose sense of self-worth, this affective, callous lack of empathy. I used to, in my younger days, demonstrate this by accidentally, on purpose, tripping over or yelling "ow," giving the impression that I'd hurt myself in class. And thankfully, quite a lot of the students reacted. So a number of them came to my aid. I didn't do anything dramatic like fall on the floor. And I said, this is what social affect means. And just because you didn't react, that doesn't mean that you don't have social affect. It could just mean that you weren't paying attention during class. But, you know, it's a good illustration. You can imagine why low social affect is important. If you're a surgeon, if somebody comes in with serious wounds, you don't want to suddenly lose it because you don't like the sight of blood or a wound. You need to be able to hold it together. And clearly, some of that is trained in. Facet 3, lifestyle need for simulation, parasitic lifestyle. So Bernie Madoff was a good example of this. You know, he exploited people and didn't really care. And then antisocial, usually criminal versatility. What's interesting about psychopathy, and there's a book by John Ronson called The Psychopathy Test. And he looked at the psychopathy test, which is in blue on the left-hand side. These are the dimensions of the psychopathy test: charm, charisma, talking about lofty ideas; conning, manipulative, lack of remorse, impulsivity, no emotion; grandiose self-appraisal, thrill-seeking. And he interviewed a guy called Al Chainsaw Dunlap, who's a renowned CEO. He would be helicoptered into failing organizations to turn them around. He went to prison for tax fraud and accounting fraud. And when Al was asked about all of these things, he said, well, you know, lofty ideas, that's visioning; lack of remorse, I have to take hard decisions; grandiose self-appraisal, you need self-confidence. And what's interesting is when you read some of the leadership literature about what makes a robust leader from empirical evidence, the words on the right kind of align with those on the left. Now, this was Paul Babiak and Robert Hare's particular way of presenting it. I'm not taking an opinion on it other than to say that the chameleon element of being a psychopath, the fact that you can adapt to your environment, means that you can give the impression of being a great leader because you're narcissistic, but you're charming, but completely corrupt. And the challenge we have, of course, is that if you're interviewing individuals, and Clive Boddy writes about this extensively, you tend to see somebody who's visionary, unshakable, action-oriented, very savvy politically, very charismatic. And if we think about the hiring problem, typically we interview people for anywhere between, 30 minutes to a couple of days. So my interview for USD was a day and a half. My interview at Warwick Business School, my previous university, was 2 hours, an hour of presentation on my research and an hour of an interview, if that. So somebody who's very good at impression management, and I'm not saying that the reason I got the job was because I'm a psychopath, don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is that it's a very short snapshot. And if underneath it you have an individual who clearly embodies the Dark Triad, they're able to be very good at impression management in interviews. And Clive Boddy in particular says that they thrive in unstructured interviews and ambiguous environments where confidence is mistaken for competence. I love the alliteration of that. So what do psychopaths do when they go into an organization? They do this. They are instrumental. They take a look at, where am I? Who are the individuals here? Let me scope out. Let me walk around. Let me go on my listening tour. Let me get to know people. And we're talking of everybody in an organization. And what they're really doing, and by the way, a lot of great leaders, that's what they do when they move in, is they listen for, a month, 6 months, a year. So that isn't a trait of psychopathy, but what a psychopath will do is on that listening tour, they go, this person seems to have a lot of visibility into expense claims and into budgets. That's the police. I need to slow down when I drive past the police, as we all do. Who's this person? Oh, they're very warm and welcoming and congratulatory and really seem to like me. And the more I work with them, the more I realize that they're the partisans. They're the people who are going to go, yeah, Simon's a great guy. I've really been impressed. He's warm, he's helpful. He goes out of his way, So partisans will have that particular perspective. There'll be the patrons or the patrons, individuals who can help elevate the psychopath's career. Quite often, Clive Boddy notes this, the patron is not necessarily your boss or your boss's boss, but it may be somebody who's influential in a slightly different division or function. Who are the pawns? And this is where my interest in psychopathy started. I was very clear that some of my students were the pawns in an executive's strive for success and strive for resources. So they're the people who are used and discarded. And then there are the patsies, the people who get the blame, because one of the key elements of a psychopath's behavior is that they will look at, who can I blame? Who can I point the finger at? Can I leave a breadcrumb trail for them? And so, this is at the heart of a psychopath. And that's supposed to be Genghis Khan in the middle, by the way. It's at the heart of how psychopaths live their life. Not just they think about it and then label everybody and then get on with their job. It's every single person has a function. Police, partisan, patron, pawn, patsy. Every single, and sometimes they move around. But it's how psychopaths think about others. And the consequence of this is, firstly, that they're not operating alone. They're using the organizational environment. This is one of the reasons why psychopaths are particularly often found at the heart of corporate failure, fraudulent activities, unnecessary redundancies, exploitation of the workforce, particularly taking credit for others' work. Another area that we're very passionate about, corporate social responsibility at USD. Certainly in some of the CSR research, I've seen that when toxic individuals come into an organization, corporate social responsibility goes out of the organization. Unilever, allegedly, are one such organization after Paul Polman left. Disheartened workforce, clearly, a lot of political decision-making. How does this entrench and advance my position. Workplace bullying, 33% of American workers experience some form of bullying or harassment. A lot of short-term decision-making. How can this help in the next year or 2 years? Because I'm going to be gone after that, or I'm hoping to advance. No focus on investor or stakeholder interest. And certainly there's a lot of expertise that leaves. And of course, environmental damage. Why would I care about the future? The tragedy of the commons is that phenomenon which says there's no incentive for me not to use up resources for myself. Why should I stop driving? Why should I not fly more miles? Because that's what I want to do. Why should I use up finite resources? And also questionable legality. So let's move on to poll 2, Cara, if you can open that up. Where actually, this is like a midterm test for you. What behaviors do you think is the clearest warning sign of toxic leadership? Repeated blaming of others, refusal to accept accountability, manipulation of facts or reality, lack of empathy or remorse, or framing critics as enemies. And you can only pick one. It's not a very fair midterm exam, but it will be an interesting insight for us.
And Simon, you do have 2 more questions. The second one, Aurelia put up right when you were showing that image of,
Oh yeah, Genghis
yes,
Khan.
yeah.
It's it's meant to be Genghis Khan. We don't have any photographs.
But he represents the
The
toxic
psychopath.
leader. Yeah.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And I think Barbara's question's a good one. They call it the psychopath contagion, which is that a toxic leader can create a toxic environment. And this is why we talk about corporate psychopathy. We talk also about psychopathic corporations. Enron be a good example. Theranos being a good example of organizations that have policies, procedures, and routines in practice, not necessarily written, that are very dysfunctional, destructive, and so forth. So, yeah, you're absolutely right, Barbara. Okay, Cara, if you want to close that poll and let's have a look at the answers. Yeah, it's interesting again. Interesting that particularly the manipulation of facts or reality, I mean, that certainly has hit a nerve at 34% of you. Lack of empathy or remorse, refusal to accept accountability, repeated blaming of others. Yeah, I mean, I get that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for your insights. I'll be interested to see this. So Machiavellianism is another element of the Dark Triad. And it's about a manipulative, calculative style of behavior to use others to gain advantage. And so there are a number of elements of manipulation that we see, almost to the point that we just heard about, how a toxic leader creates a toxic environment. It normalizes dishonesty. And I've certainly seen that firsthand in consulting work over the decades, where from time to time, let me give an example if I can. I was an advisor to the UK government, as Bridget mentioned at the start. This was in the end of the last century, early part of this century. And it was very interesting that you'd come across small pockets in a local government of where there'd been corruption and there'd been fraud taking place. And as we were trying to professionalize procurement and get more data, these things came to surface. And certainly PricewaterhouseCoopers have found that where you have pathological fraud in procurement as opposed to opportunistic, there's clearly a culture of dishonesty. It also undermines the shared reality. I mean, one of the things I love about working at USD is that if you ask anybody who works at USD, they'll have different ways of phrasing it, but they'll say, we care. We care about students. We care about our community. We care about the world that our students are going to create and lead. And we care about each other. And that shared reality is, something that gets undermined if you have toxicity. But it's an element of Machiavellian manipulation. It's a way in which one asserts control, is because if you remember those 5 roles, if you have pawns, in other words, you're all of a sudden you're inside this criminal activity. You're going down. If I go down, to paraphrase Robert De Niro or Al Pacino in any number of movies, and it justifies that misconduct. A big challenge, though, a big challenge, but a great opportunity with the Dark Triad is this: it's projection. And what projection is where an individual claims something, but really they're turning a mirror on themselves. I'll pick an example for me. It's like me saying to somebody else, you're untidy, you never do the dishes. Well, hands up, that's me. I've got a dishwasher. I put the stuff in there. If there are dishes in the sink, they'll be all right till the next cycle, but I'm projecting, that's an example of projecting. It's attributing one's own traits to others. It's very prevalent when you look at narcissism, and you'll see that. There's a lot of instrumental, not defensive projection. So often changing the subject. And we use projection to change narratives. Thank you, Barbara, for your comment about the fraud issue. Sounds like our current political environment. I think, sadly, it's not just our current political environment. I think it's a trait in many political environments, whether it's local government, whether it's national government, whether it's in the Americas, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Africa. We see it all the time, that fraud is prevalent. And I'd love to do a session purely on fraud. But one of the key things about fraud is that it happens because there's opportunity, and we'll come on to that. Not fraud, but we'll come on to opportunity. But you preempted this comment, Barbara, that in public rhetoric, and I don't mean necessarily in the public and political sphere, I mean public in an organization or amongst a group or amongst a community, is accusations of lying and corruption, moral condemnation of others, and repetition and amplification. And we also go from projecting to gaslighting, this reality distortion, loyalty over truth, and social reinforcement. These are all pretty toxic patterns of Machiavellian behavior. But let's get into our third poll, and this is our third and final poll. And if you can post that up, please. So the question is, which of these following best describes projection in leadership rhetoric? Again, you just got to pick your favorite one. Taking responsibility for harm caused. Is that an example of projection? Attributing one's own traits or behaviors to others, encouraging open dialogue and disagreement, showing empathy towards critics.
Simon, can I quickly clarify, because I'm interested? The first one, taking responsibility for harm and cause. What you're saying is that the leader knows that they are actually responsible for the harm, but they're trying to project it on the employee, making it the employee's fault?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like when somebody reverses into your car and then says, you drove into me. That's an example of misattribution of fault. That's a very common Machiavellian stroke dark triad trait. And projection is a very useful thing to observe because it's like a mirror on the soul in some ways. Okay, do you want to close that down, Cara, and share the results? Well done. Yes, 87% got the right answer. It was just a little bit of fun really, I think we get the idea about projection. So let me move into psychopathy for the final sort of 10 minutes of this webinar. So in the research that I've carried out, we use an instrument called the Psychopathic Personality Inventory, and the R means revised. And the reason we do that is because it's an instrument that's designed for studying what are called community populations. In other words, people who are not in prison or in a mental health institution, but it's for corporate and general public. And the interesting thing about, one of the interesting things about the PPI is that it has three factors to describe psychopathy. Fearless dominance. I'm not scared of the snake and I'm going to take charge. Self-centered impulsivity and cold-heartedness. And you can see how those embody what we've already talked about in terms of psychopathy. I'm not going to get into this in a lot of detail about the instrument, just to say a few things about what the PPI does. It's a survey instrument. We ourselves have used it 3 times in the last decade, and we're just in the midst of our biggest study with about 1,400 respondents, where we're looking at how people perform, how people score on these variables. So what did we find? What we found was quite a high incidence of psychopathic disorder in corporate executive level population. So I had a hypothesis that people who work in procurement, because they have the opportunity to be important, in other words, well, I worked in procurement. One of the reasons I love working in procurement was that suppliers treated me well. They treated me as important because I was awarding contracts, choosing suppliers, and negotiating prices. They treated me as important because at high days and holidays, they would provide gifts, take you out for lunch. Again, this is last century stuff, not this century stuff. And I thought, well, I wonder if this comes back to one of your earlier questions, whether this will develop some form of narcissism. So we thought that there would be a higher incidence of psychopathy, in corporate psychopathy, in purchasing and supply than in the general corporate population. We did not find a statistically significant difference. What we did find was this. I'm going to take a drink because it's making my heart race to think about this every time I read it. We found that 12% of our sample scored somewhere above a clinical cutoff for elements of psychopathic traits. And I choose those words carefully. Firstly, most people did not show any sign of psychopathy, but there were those who showed more than a random high incidence of psychopathy. And we found 1 in 8, 12% of individuals had degrees of psychopathic personality disorder. And I'll come on to what they look like in a minute, what those traits look like. And this kind of mirrored some previous research, because there is research which says about 1% of the general population scores above the cutoff for psychopathy. Kate Fritz, and my co-author, her first study didn't necessarily show a high incidence necessarily. What she found was that business executives had very similar levels of narcissism, histrionic, and compulsive traits to those in mental institutes, prisons, and psychiatric prisons. So it kind of backs up previous research. You'll recall that when I was reading out the definition from Hervé Cleckley, that he used the word he, because the prevailing wisdom was that psychopaths were all male. I don't know why. It was lack of research, to be honest. But we found that males had slightly more propensity to psychopathy than females. But more importantly, that it manifested itself very differently in females to males. And how it manifested itself is that females in our study who scored above the clinical cutoff for psychopathy tended to score highly on those factors of carefree non-planfulness. In other words, they might go around the rules, policies, procedures. They might dig their heels in to do things that are normally not acceptable from a policy or a process point of view. Also scored more highly in cold-heartedness. In other words, that ability to be dispassionate. Whereas the male who scored high on psychopathy tended to be characterized by fearlessness. Kind of alpha male is the best way of describing it. So there is a gender body of gender research which kind of supports this a little bit, and we're trying to explore it even further. That psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism manifest themselves differently in females to males, statistically differently. That means that not every woman who's scores highly on psychopathy is completely different from every male. It's just that statistically there's some difference between the distributions. For those of you who love the numbers, here they are. I'm not going to leave it here very long. You can go onto YouTube and freeze the screen and analyze it. But the key differences we found in between the genders, with, as I say, that males scored lower on carefree non-planfulness than females, scored lower on cold-heartedness than females, but higher on fearlessness. Okay, what do we do about it? The best illustration, I think, is the same way, and this is meant to be dolphins dealing with sharks. The way that we know dolphins behave around sharks is that they collaborate. So one-on-one, your shark's going to win. You know, one dolphin versus one shark. It's not a good time for a dolphin. But dolphins are social animals, and the way they deal with sharks is by collectively repelling. And that's really at the heart of the way to deal with toxic individuals. But I wanted to spend a bit more time on that. I think, firstly, it's establishing psychological capital or emotional capital in organizations is that sense of well-being. To what extent do we have hope? To what extent are we efficient? To what extent are we resilient? What extent are we optimistic? And we know when we think about how we sustain ourselves through difficult times, when you've got that colleague or that partner who's always hopeful or always optimistic, or is a positive character, that strong psychological capital is so important. I've certainly found that myself, you know, being with somebody who has that optimism, always looks on the bright side, can really lift spirits, makes all the difference. And I think that's an important element of a culture in an organization. And it was described as, you know, leaders may come and go, but the workers remain. So it's one of the things we have as workers, as those who may or may not have toxic leaders, one of those things that we have responsibility for, which is establishing an environment where we work together and support each other. We can get into a little bit more detail, and this is some of the things I do recommend. Relentless documentation, this tactical neutralization, that we document every interaction, every directive, and every instance of reckless behavior. The reason for this is that we quite often don't believe our own eyes. We don't see patterns. We have recency bias. We have all sorts of biases. One of the things, if you've ever taken any of my classes, that I've recommended is keeping a journal. Keeping a journal in life is very good. Keeping a journal in the workplace, because, and now with, you know, online journals or using your phone and using AI, you can start to see patterns that aren't always painfully evident. One of the things that a number of students said to me years ago was, it's me. I just can't get on with, I'll call him Alan. That wasn't his name. I can't get on with Alan, but I just think he doesn't like me. And, everybody says he's such a really nice guy, but I can't put my finger on it. And I did say, well, document every instance. And when you looked at the documentation over the space of a year, it was really interesting. Microaggressions is one way of describing it, was how this person was coping with it. So I really encourage documentation, both formal and keeping journals. I also think about having hardened boundaries. It says here, never sign documents or agreements that make you liable for reckless decisions. And also choose your battles strategically. I mean, this is kind of how we manage bosses anyway. We think about our boundaries. A boss will want to bring in changes. Many of them are not driven by any personal agenda. They're driven by, this is how I think we should operate. Choose your battles. What are the things, what battle you're prepared to stand up? And healthy detachment, easier said than done, but healthy detachment is important. So that tactical neutralization is one important. Also recognize what's outside your sphere of control and what's inside your sphere of control. You can't change somebody's personality. Not everybody is like us. That's the big failing that we have as humans. We think everybody thinks like we do. As you get older, you realize that they don't. But, if you've got kids or, in my case, grandkids, it's interesting seeing how they make sense of the world, how they think about it. Teenagers in particular. Teenagers will say, oh, the girls don't like me. They're really mean to me. They pick on me because, they don't like my hair. They don't like the shoes I'm wearing. Everybody hates me and they really dislike me. And actually, they probably never think about you. Every other teenager is thinking about their own insecurities. So keep that in mind. Think about what you have control over, your emotional reactions, your professional detachment. How do you avoid it? You've got three strategies. It's called exit, voice, and loyalty. I'm not recommending loyalty to somebody who you're convinced is toxic. That doesn't make long-term logic sense. So voice, can you manage it in place? Can you deploy those tactical neutralizations? Can you establish the hard boundaries? Invest in psychological capital. So quite a lot of initiatives, and we have them at USD. A lot of initiatives are community initiatives where employees get together around particular ideas, particular issues, whether it's mentoring, whether it's service, whether it's technology. And those groups are where you find your release and your comfort. So that's your managing in place. The other is making sure that you seek options. Can you get out of here? Can you get legal advice? Big caveat here, corporate HR is not there to protect you, they're there to protect the company. And I think this is one of the issues that when I say we, myself, Kate, and Nathan have come across quite a lot in our research, is the surprise when you report something to HR that you do not get a pat on the back and elevation and awards and kudos and that the organization tries to deal with the situation and remove the organization's liability, not your liability per se. And thinking about, where's your next move? And we call this sort of systemic inoculation. I'm a supply chain guy. So some of the things I talk about is that transparency, have unbending rules and processes, visible sanctions for toxic behavior. And toxic behavior can be intentional avoidance of the rules and the policies and procedures. I think prioritizing psychological safety, having wellness support, 360-degree reviews are really important. They're not just important because they give a voice to subordinates. They're important because they provide an equitable voice and a good way of understanding the climate. And just make sure it's very clear what is and is not to be done. So why does it matter? This is my last slide, and then we'll open up for any other questions. Please use the Q&A section to post any questions that you've got. I'll see if I can see any. Yep, there's one there. It matters because we see it everywhere. There's certainly the amount of research now that's carried out into Dark Triad finds incidents everywhere. We need to understand warning signs in leadership. Part of this webinar is to just give you a flavor for some of the things to look at, particularly projection, and make sure that you understand where you're accountable and where you're not accountable. Yeah, an interesting comment here about trying to be optimistic and give positive affirmation even to a toxic person. We have to be very careful that we don't label anybody who's difficult to deal with as psychopathic, narcissistic, or Machiavellian. Some people are just difficult to deal with, because of their personalities, and it may not, and it certainly won't always be psychopathy. And one of the warnings I always give at the end of these talks is the minute you know more about psychopaths, you see them everywhere. And John Ronson, who wrote the book, The Psychopath Test, and there's a great YouTube video of him discussing this, he will say, the problem is you start to see psychopaths everywhere, but they're rare. Toxic leadership can exist because somebody who's in a leadership or supervisory position is concerned about their position, is concerned about their and their department's performance, has an ill-informed view of what would constitute good performance as well. So often it's incompetence and not toxicity, so there are all of these things. I sound really negative when I talk about this, but the topic is we're dealing with a dysfunctional side of personality. Do I think the rise in mental health awareness and treatment will curb the amount of leaders with dark triad traits? I don't know what the evidence is in terms of the rise of mental health awareness and treatment. There's a massive shortage of psychologists and psychiatrists, clinical psychiatrists around the world. And so the support is very difficult to get. Clearly, services such as BetterHelp and people increasingly being aware of their own well-being, but it's not universal. We may be a rarefied sample of individuals. What are the best day-to-day strategies? Keeping a journal is the best day-to-day strategy. Finding allies, finding others in the organization, not necessarily to, form an alliance against the toxic individual, just for that psychological capital, just for a sanity check. Is there a way to ensure reward structures do not reward psychopathy? Well, sadly, in a lot of cases, the reward structures are fundamentally about rewarding short-term financial gains, which immediately opens up one opportunity for corruption and one opportunity for fraud. I'm mindful of our time barrier. I'm now no longer in charge. I hand it back to you, Cara and Bridget.
Another huge thank you to Simon, to our alumni who are still on the call. Thank you. Those of us who work at USD, Simon, Bridget, and I, we see the good work that our alumni are doing out in their boardrooms, in their classrooms, in their church halls, in their living rooms. Thank you for representing our alma mater so beautifully. Know that we appreciate you. You are valued members of our community, and we hope that you have a beautiful weekend.